this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
On News World Podcast, we're celebrating America's 250th birthday, and I ask my guests how they're spending their 4th of July. Brett Baer.
I will be working. I'll be in Washington because it's a big, big day.
Jared Isaacman.
I plan to be flying an F-5 fighter jet painted in Freedom 250 colors, along with 4 other fighter jets flying over the nation's capital.
Listen to News World on the iHeart Radio app, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast.
This is Red Pilled America. There's one topic Hollywood never seems to tire of, and that's slavery. The films keep coming.
Mrs. Stubbs won't even grab me no soap to clean with. I stink so much to make myself gag.
True stories about black men kidnapped into bondage, historical fictions about the antebellum South, and revenge fantasies where the slave owners get what's coming to them. There is no shortage of films and TV shows that have touched on America's original sin. But there's one question a Hollywood blockbuster has never answered. Who was America's first slave owner?
It's not like there isn't a historical record on the topic. We know the first ship carrying Africans to America, court records still exist addressing slave ownership, plantation inventories have been preserved in historical societies, and laws establishing slavery have been memorialized in the history books. Yet Hollywood hasn't created a film about the first villain of America's peculiar institution. Why is that? First seemed to play well on the big screen. The first man on the moon, the first black Major League Baseball player, the first black president. Each of these firsts had a film dedicated to their story. And Hollywood loves immortalizing villains, Al Capone, Jesse James, and Adolf Hitler. But nothing on the first American slave owner?
And slavery isn't some forgotten topic. Centuries after its founding, America is still reeling from the fallout of slavery, even in historically free states.
Important conversation continues in Illinois as a state commission on reparations works to address some of the deep and lasting impacts of slavery.
Governor Gavin Newsom has signed several laws pushing for potential reparations for descendants of slavery.
The beautiful thing about reparations is really just about equalizing the playing field.
Slavery happened a long time ago. The repercussions of it are still going on today.
My ancestors fought hard, and they died being unable to, realize a lot of what it meant to be an American citizen. And I just want to make sure that future generations don't have to have the struggles that current generations are struggling through now.
So with all this interest in the topic, who was America's first slave owner? I'm Patrick Carolci.
And I'm Adriana Cortez.
And we promise only one thing, the truth. Welcome to Red Pilled America. Who is America's first slave owner? That villain should be a household name. I mean, most high school students can rattle off names for America's first traitor or the first presidential assassin, but almost no one can say who America's first slave owner was. Why is that? One black celebrity may have the answer. She's a vocal proponent of reparations and set out to track down the history of her ancestors. What she found may explain why this question is hard to approach. But to appreciate her story, we first need to understand the early days of the English colonies. Because what we'll learn is that when investigating the question, who was America's first slave owner? The answer complicates the narrative on America's original sin.
It was a normal day on the Johnson plantation, in the early days of the Virginia colony, when a panicked servant rushed to a high-ranking visitor. Captain Samuel Goldsmith arrived with one purpose: to buy a large barrel of tobacco. But what happened next would drag him into the history of American slavery. The panicked servant begged the captain for help, explaining that he'd come to the plantation as an indentured servant 14 years earlier. But the plantation owner, a farmer named Anthony Johnson, had kept him for far too long and wouldn't set him free.
I came into Virginia for 7 or 8 years of indenture, but Master Johnson has kept me here 7 years longer than he should.
The servant pled with Captain Goldsmith for help in securing his freedom. The tobacco customer immediately switched gears. With the servant in tow, he marched over to Anthony and demanded to see the servant's indentured paperwork. But Anthony looked confused.
I've never seen any indenture. I have this Negro for his life.
As Anthony saw it, the servant was his property, but the servant continued his defiance, demanding his freedom. The battle lines would eventually harden, and the disagreement would set off a chain of events that helped legalize slavery in the American colonies. But this event has never been featured on the big screen, never broadcast as a miniseries, and is rarely discussed in U.S. history classes. And that's likely because the plantation owner, Anthony Johnson, who claimed he owned the servant, was himself a black man. The story of Anthony Johnson is one of the most fascinating tales of the origin of slavery in the English-American colonies, because it disrupts a long-established narrative that slave owners were exclusively white. The actual history is far more complicated, and the story of Anthony Johnson and his servant helps illuminate the truth behind American slavery.
The first time Anthony Johnson is definitively documented in the Virginia colony is in the early 1650s. At the time, one of the biggest problems facing the colony was people. Virginia needed bodies to work the land. So the colony came up with what was called the headright system. When the Virginia Company of London first set up a colony in Jamestown in 1607, the conditions were absolutely brutal. If settlers didn't die from hunger, most were taken out by disease, weather, or conflict with local Indians. To give an idea of how harsh the conditions were, in 1609, there were 500 settlers in Jamestown. By the spring of 1610, only 60 were still alive. Almost 90% of the early colonists perished. Jamestown was on the verge of collapse. But then in 1612, a colonist and merchant named John Rolfe successfully cultivated a marketable strain of tobacco. It transformed Virginia from a struggling outpost into a potentially profitable colony. The problem was that people were needed to grow this new crop. So in 1618, the Virginia Company of London established the headright system. The basic idea was simple. If you bring people to Virginia, you receive land, 50 acres per head to be exact. Suppose you paid for yourself, your wife, your son, and 2 servants to travel to Virginia from England. 5 people times 50 meant you would receive a 250-acre spread. So a single Englishman could pay for his own trip to Virginia and receive 50 acres, or a wealthy merchant could sponsor many workers and accumulate large tracts of land. This is how people arrived in Virginia under the indentured servant contracts. The sponsor would pay their passage and in return receive their labor and the headright land. The servant was legally bound to work for the sponsor for several years, but would eventually be set free. And it wasn't just white Englishmen that benefited from this system. Black families also acquired land in the Virginia colony through headrights. In fact, the first headright grant of land given to a black man that we know of was in July 1651, when Anthony Johnson received 250 acres in Northampton County for importing 5 people into Virginia's eastern shore. And given the surnames of the people Anthony imported, like Thomas Bembrose, Peter Bugby, and others, it appears that Anthony likely had some white indentured servants. The next time Anthony Johnson pops up in the historical record is in 1653, and the moment provides a surprising picture of the early status of some blacks in the British colony.
Shortly after acquiring his 250 acres, Anthony almost lost his entire plantation to a tragic fire. To survive, he petitioned the local court for relief. He and his wife, Mary, testified to being in Virginia for over 30 years. The court acknowledged their hard work, honored service to the country, and loss from the unfortunate fire, and issued a judgment.
From the day of the debate hereof during their natural lives, the said Mary Johnson and 2 daughters of Anthony Johnson Negro be disengaged and freed from payment of taxes and levies in Northampton County for public use.
In 1653 Virginia, taxes were primarily levied on free men and adult servants. Children and most white free women were not taxed. So, for the women in Anthony Johnson's home to be excluded from taxation for life meant Anthony was on equal footing with the free white men of the Virginia colony. But shortly after the judgment, Anthony would face off with one of his servants, and the case would result in what some historians cite as the first government-endorsed slave owner in America.
Licorice, licorice, where art thou, licorice? If you listen to Red Pilled America, you know that I love licorice, and there is no licorice in America better than the delicious gourmet licorice made by the Licorice Guy. The Licorice Guy is simply the best. What sets their licorice apart is its flavor and freshness. They have a great selection of flavors to choose from, like red, blue raspberry, black, and green apple, just to name a few. The freshness of the Licorice Guy is unlike anything you've ever tasted in licorice before. Seriously, if you haven't tried licorice from the Licorice Guy yet, then you ain't living life right. Trust me, you will not regret it. It's time to dump that store-bought licorice that's so hard it'll break your teeth and get yourself the soft, fresh stuff from the Licorice Guy. What I also love about the Licorice Guy is that it's an American family-owned business. It's made right here in the beautiful US of A. We are big proponents of buying American and supporting American workers. Right now, Red Pilled America listeners get 15% off when they enter RPA15 at checkout. Visit licoriceguy.com and enter RPA15 at checkout. That's licoriceguy.com. They ship daily. Treat yourself and those you love and taste the difference.
This is Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House and a proud American citizen. I'm celebrating America's 250th birthday on my podcast, Newt's World, with 15 special episodes. And I've got some great guests. Walter Isaacson, Jonathan Turley, Brett Baer.
I will be working because it's a big, big day. I'll be in Washington and have all kinds of coverage through the day of America 250.
Rachel Compost-Duffy.
There's nothing like American music. We're the home of rock and roll. We're the home of rap. We're the home of pop music.
Eric Metaxas. Jared Isaacman.
I plan to be flying an F-5 fighter jet painted in Freedom 250 colors, along with 4 other fighter jets flying over the nation's capital.
The story of the national anthem and the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Join me and let's celebrate America's 250. Listen to Newt's World on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Red Pilled America. So in November 1654, when Captain Samuel Goldsmith arrived at the Johnson plantation to buy tobacco, he was approached by a black servant named John Cassor. Cassor had been protesting for a while that he'd served his time, but the plantation owner, Anthony Johnson, refused to recognize his freedom. So when Captain Goldsmith arrived, Cassor saw his chance. The captain was a man the local government had turned to for help in settling disputes. Cassor begged him to intervene, but when the captain demanded to see Cassor's indentured paperwork, Anthony looked confused.
I've never seen any indenture. I have this Negro for his life.
That's when 2 white neighbors stepped in, the brothers Robert and George Parker. Robert told the captain that Cassor did in fact come as an indentured servant.
John Cassor had an indenture in Mr. Sandy's hand on the other side of the bay.
The brothers decided they were going to take the matter into their own hands. In their view, Anthony was illegally holding Cassor, so they told the servant to come live with them and work on their farm as a free man. And George Parker took it a step further.
If you don't set John free, he'll sue and be awarded your cows.
Anthony appeared physically shook by the threat. He'd recently lost almost his entire plantation to a fire, so losing his cattle would have been catastrophic. The threat put the fear of God into the family, and Anthony caved. In a formal statement, he set John Cassor free and agreed to the traditions of the time.
I do promise, according to the custom of servants, to pay unto the said John Cassor corn and leather.
Cassor was a free man. But after some time and deliberation, Anthony changed his mind. He decided he wanted Cassor back for the duration of the servant's life. So Anthony filed a civil complaint, not against John Cassor, but instead against the white farmer, Robert Parker, who had possession of his property. His complaint read,
Mr. Robert Parker, he detaineth one John Cassor, a Negro, the plaintiff's servant, under pretense that said John Cassor is a free man.
Anthony wanted the court to decide whether Cassor was a servant that served his 7 years of indenture, or instead was Anthony's slave for life. The court accepted the complaint and collected testimony from Captain Goldsmith. It also considered statements from Robert and George Parker. The judge eventually issued his verdict, and it would be a pivotal moment in the legalization of slavery in the colonies. The judge found that Robert Parker had in fact unrightfully kept John Cassor from his, quote, rightful master, Anthony Johnson. So he issued his decision.
Be it therefore the judgment of the court, and ordered that the said John Cassor Negro shall forthwith be turned into the service of his said master, Anthony Johnson, and that the said Mr. Robert Parker make payment of all charges in the suit and execution.
Effectively, the judge found that John Cassor was the property of Anthony Johnson. The court deemed Cassor a chattel slave, chattel meaning personal property. The court could have said a black man could not own another man, but it didn't. The court didn't care that Anthony was black. So does this make Anthony Johnson America's first slave owner? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back further into the history of the Virginia colony to see if the government had ever designated someone the property of another.
Africans had been present in North America since the early 1500s. They accompanied Spanish expeditions through the Caribbean, Mexico, Florida, and what is now the American Southwest. But the earliest, widely accepted documented evidence of Africans arriving in the English colonies that would eventually become the United States comes from a letter written by colonist John Rolfe, the same man that developed Virginia's first marketable tobacco strain. On January 30th, 1620, Rolfe sent a report to the Virginia Company of London describing recent events in the colony. He noted the arrival of a ship in late August 1619 that
brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals.
Victuals being food and supplies. The colonists that Rolfe referenced are two well-documented individuals, the governor of Virginia, George Yeardley, and the Cape merchant, Abraham Piercy, effectively the colony's chief commercial officer. So does that make one of these colonists America's first slave owner? Well, not exactly. When Rolfe wrote that they bought the Africans, the transaction he was describing was likely about labor. At the time, labor was purchasable. There was also no slave code in the colony. Contrary to the claims of many historians, they were not brought to Virginia as part of a planned English slave trading enterprise. Through cross-referencing Spanish, Portuguese, and English records with Rolfe's letter, historians have identified the ship that arrived carrying the Africans as the White Lion, a state-sanctioned piracy vessel with a license to attack, plunder, and capture the merchant and supply vessels of enemy nations. The White Lion and another piracy vessel attacked a Portuguese ship near Mexico. On it were slaves brought from Angola, Africa. The White Lion commandeered the slaves on the ship and brought them to the Virginia colonies in late August 1619. Were these Africans slaves when they arrived in the colony? Well, an interpretation based on the known facts points to a likely different status. At the time in late August 1619, Virginia had no law establishing or defining slavery. The colony did, however, have laws and customs concerning labor and indentured servitude, laws and customs being implemented by Governor George Yeardley himself. The English had experience with serfdom, servants, apprentices, and captives taken during war. But England had no clear body of common law saying a person may be held as chattel property for life. Thousands of English laborers came to Virginia under contracts requiring them to work for a fixed number of years in exchange for passage, food, and eventual freedom dues, which were items given to the servants once they served their terms. That was the legal framework the colony understood best in 1619. So when Rolfe wrote that Governor Yeardley and Cape merchant Percy bought the Africans, it was likely a purchase of labor, not human beings.
Some have argued that Africans that arrived in late August 1619 were de facto slaves, but the historical record complicates that interpretation. In the decades that followed Rolfe's letter, we find Africans who owned property, sued in court, completed terms of services, acquired land, married, and became free. In fact, many historians believe Anthony Johnson and his wife Mary are seen in these early colony documents traversing each of these accomplishments. On March 22, 1622, a tribe of Indians coordinated an attack on an entire Virginia colony over Good Friday. They killed 347 settlers, almost 30% of the colony's population. The surviving settlers fortified the colony, struck back against the Indian tribes, and got their revenge. But as the dust settled, the Virginia Company of London ordered an accounting of the surviving and dead. A kind of census was performed. In February 1624, people went from settlement to settlement taking down names, and two were recorded that many believed were Anthony Johnson and his wife. On the plantation of Edward Bennett, there was an Anthony and Margaret. The following year's census recorded an Antonio and Mary at the same Bennett plantation, both black, both arriving on ships from England. This corresponds with Anthony and Mary's testimony when they asked for tax relief from the fire. This is all to say that Africans that arrived in the Virginia colony in 1619 were not given slave status by default. There were Africans that went on to become free landowners. When John Rolfe wrote that Governor Yeardley and Cape merchant Abraham Piercy bought the Africans from the White Lion, it likely fell within the system in place at the time in Virginia, that being indentured servitude. They weren't necessarily slaves. Their labor was likely being bought. But there were soon signs that black indentured servants were being viewed differently under the law by Virginia courts. In 1640, 3 men ran away from a tobacco plantation in Virginia and headed north towards Maryland. The first was a Dutchman named Victor. The second, a Scotsman named James. The third, an African named John Punch. All 3 were servants of a Virginia planter named Christopher Harmon. The men had likely spent years working Virginia's tobacco fields, and like many indentured servants before them, the 3 decided they wanted out. So they ran. For a brief moment, they were free. Then they were caught. The trio were arrested in Maryland and hauled back to Virginia. Soon they stood before the colony's highest court. The facts weren't in dispute. All 3 men had committed the same offense. The judge issued his verdict. The Scotsman and Dutchman both received the same punishment, a whipping and additional years of service. But the African was handed something far different. The court ordered that John Punch serve his master, Christopher Harmon, for the time of his natural life. 2 white servants committed the same crime, yet only the African lost the possibility of freedom. So, was Christopher Harmon the first slave owner? Some historians say yes, but there's a problem with that assessment.
In an era where large labor disruption could literally cause widespread death, the Virginia colony policed labor contracts strictly and severely. There was no prison system, so harsh judgments were delegated to the settlers to orchestrate. But the critical point is that in the John Punch case, lifetime servitude was issued as a criminal punishment. In the John Cassor case, lifetime servitude appeared as a property right. The colony had taken a significant step. So if Christopher Harmon, Governor George Yeardley, or Cape merchant Abraham Piercy are not the first slave owners, does that leave Anthony Johnson? Well, there are other candidates. In 1646, 8 years before the Anthony Johnson case, a colonist named Francis Pott was preparing to leave Virginia. He wrote out a contract to transfer his property to another colonist named Stephen Charlton. In it, he imparted 2 Africans, a woman and a boy, to be
to the use of him, his heirs, etc., forever.
Contracts were being made transferring Africans as property. So does that make either Francis Pott or Stephen Charlton America's first slave owner? Some would put the line here. This 1646 transfer of 2 Africans from one colonist to another is possibly the first documented contractual slave owner. White colonists were making assignments of Africans as slaves for life, and county courts were recording and recognizing the existence of these contracts. And there were other Virginia county contracts claiming Africans as property. The issue here is none of these contracts were tested in court. The county clerk may have accepted and recorded the transaction, but it does not necessarily mean a Virginia court would have enforced the transaction if challenged. And Virginia was not the only colony experimenting with slavery prior to slavery laws being passed. Massachusetts Bay was another.
This is Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House and a proud American citizen. I'm celebrating America's 250th birthday on my podcast, Newt's World, with 15 special episodes. And I've got some great guests. Walter Isaacson, Jonathan Turley, Brett Baer.
I will be working because it's a big, big day. I'll be in Washington and have all kinds of coverage through the day of America 250.
Rachel Campos Duffy.
There's nothing like American music. We're the home of rock and roll. We're the home of rap. We're the home of pop music.
Eric Metaxas. Jared Isaacman.
I plan to be flying an F-5 fighter jet painted in Freedom 250 colors, along with 4 other fighter jets flying over the nation's capital.
The story of the national anthem and the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Join me and let's celebrate America's 250. Listen to Newt's World on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast.
In 1638, British travelogue author John Jocelyn wrote about Samuel Maverick in Massachusetts Bay, holding a black woman and child as slaves. In 1639, during a disciplinary matter with Harvard's first headmaster, Nathaniel Eaton, it was revealed that he had a non-white servant referred to as the Moor, who contemporaries thought was probably a slave. According to ecclesiastical records, Puritan Massachusetts settler Israel Stoughton was said to own a servant named Dorcas. And over in Connecticut, the 1645 estate of George Willis was said to have included African slaves in his listings of property. But the issue with each of these is that the evidence is either thin, hearsay, incidental, imprecise, or ambiguous. They don't show a deed or an adjudicated property claim like we see in Virginia. In the case of Anthony Johnson, Anthony made a lifelong property claim to his servant John Casor, and the court upheld that claim. And this may be the reason why Hollywood has never created a blockbuster film immortalizing America's first slave owner, because investigating the historical record complicates the narrative around slavery.
Remember the black celebrity we introduced at the beginning of this story? The reparations advocate that wanted to explore the history of her ancestry? Well, it was Sunny Hostin, co-host of The View. She has long been a proponent of reparations for slavery. But when asked to participate in PBS's show Finding Your Roots, Sunny expressed some reservations.
I just sensed that there could be something in my family history that would be disappointing.
She eventually agreed to participate, and the investigators found something interesting on her mother's side. They were from Spain, where they owned slaves.
The family business, I had been told that they were printers and journalists, but they were in fact enslavers.
This may explain why Hollywood has not produced a movie about the first American slave owner, because the answer confuses a long-established narrative. Popular culture often presents slavery as a story with only two roles, black slaves and white slave owners. However, the closer you look at the documents, the more complex the story becomes. But complicated history is difficult to turn into slogans.
I still believe in reparations. I still believe this country has a lot to do in terms of racial justice. So y'all can stop texting me and emailing me and saying that I'm a white girl and that I don't deserve reparations.
So who is America's first slave owner? Well, if you draw the line at judicial recognition of slave ownership, it could be argued that the African colonist Anthony Johnson was the first American slave owner. But giving him the crown wouldn't provide the full picture. Before Anthony's case, we see lifetime servitude punishment, property contracts, and contemporary witnesses, all citing specific people as slave owners. They may not have been adjudicated, but slavery was indeed being practiced. In 1645, colonists kidnapped Africans and brought them to Massachusetts Bay as servants. A judge ordered them returned to their homeland, showing that colonists were attempting to hold enslaved Africans in Massachusetts long before a Virginia court adjudicated John Casor's status. But the Anthony Johnson case does show a critical shift. John Punch was sentenced to lifetime servitude in 1640. 15 years later, John Casor became the next evolution, lifetime servitude not as punishment, but as property. A court deemed he was owned by Anthony Johnson. We started this episode looking for the first slave owner. We expected to find a white man. Instead, we found Anthony Johnson. And we expected slavery to divide neatly along racial lines. Instead, we found something much more complex. But it wasn't an institution solely practiced by whites.
The family business, I had been told that they were printers and journalists, but they were in fact enslavers.
There were black slave owners throughout the colonial period, at the birth of the nation, and all the way to the Civil War. Yet this part of the story rarely appears in popular discussions of American slavery, and maybe that's because complicated history is difficult to weaponize.
Red Pilled America is an iHeartRadio original podcast. It's owned and produced by Patrick Corelchi and me, Adriana Cortez, for Informed Ventures. To listen to our entire archive of episodes, ad-free, visit redpilledamerica.com and click Join in the top menu. Thanks for listening.
On News World Podcast, we're celebrating America's 250th birthday, and I ask my guests how they're spending their 4th of July. Brett Baer.
I will be working. I'll be in Washington because it's a big, big day.
Jared Isaacman.
I plan to be flying an F-5 fighter jet painted in Freedom 250 colors, along with 4 other fighter jets flying over the nation's capital.
Listen to News World on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast.